Okay, picking up where we left off on page 466, we're talking about the testing process and how a code review can be useful not just for bugs, but for helping people be better programmers. The next type of testing is called unit testing, and that is I'm working on a particular module and I just test that one module. And there are a lot of the IDEs we've been talking about, like Visual Studio, have unit testing built in where you can actually like feed. You write a module that does something. Let's say you're writing something that added two numbers together. It'll actually feed numbers into that and to make sure it comes up with the correct answer. And you can run these tests and see if all the assumptions that you made are correct, things like that. So unit testing is these individual little modules, and they're typically done by the very same programmer who wrote the thing to begin with. So that's what unit testing is. Okay, integration testing is where, okay, I've done the unit testing for this piece, and I've done the unit testing for this piece, but you know, maybe I should test how they work together. Integration testing, yes. And I might not have written both of these. I may have written just one. So integration testing is typically done with a team where you bolt things together and make sure that they talk. I mean, I've set it up so that, you know, I receive this number from this module and you get the answer back from this module. But it'd be kind of helpful to try it and make sure it worked first. There is another testing that typically happens in here that's not in the books called regression testing. I have applications, for example, that are designed to root out and ferret out information about the computer itself. So it's very, very specific, for example, like what version of Windows you have. So whenever I make a change, I have to kind of go back in time and make sure that those changes didn't break anything. So I'm developing on Windows 8, and then I have to go back to see if it broke anything in Vista, or if it broke anything in 7, if it broke anything in Windows XP. So regression testing. And the same thing happens in the web. You know, I may have IE10 that I'm using on my machine when I'm developing my web page, but I need to test it on IE9, IE8, IE7, and you know, Firefox, and you know, Chrome, and Opera, and all these other guys. So regression testing is kind of going back in time. And then system testing. System testing is when, okay, I've done the integration testing of all the pieces. Now let's see if the whole thing works. And those testings, you typically have a test plan. I mean, you've actually got it lined out. I mean, do this, do this, do this. More than likely, you've got dummy data that you can start playing with. You know, where I actually put stuff in there, make sure it works, or maybe I already have dummy data in the database I can draw upon to do these kinds of things. So system testing is the overall testing now that everything is done. And the testing really should, one of the things that we used to do is we would grab a user who's not been involved, okay, not been involved at all, and say, here's the documentation. So using the example I have here on the board, here's the documentation. I want you to create an overtime request, and watch. Just sit back and watch and see what they do, because one of the testings you need to be doing is testing the documentation. Yeah, okay. So all the components are all together, and all the system can handle whatever the predicted volume you need to do. Yep, that makes sense. Okay, on page 469, they talk about the 4 different types of documentation that occurs. The first type of documentation is the internal programmer-to-programmer documentation. And this could consist of lots and lots of comments inside your source code. That's a good place. There's an art form to this on how much information you ought to put and where you ought to put it and how often you ought to put it. I've seen, during code reviews, I've seen programs that had no documentation whatsoever, and I've seen way too much documentation. So I'm going to do one here. This is documentation for that particular application we just talked about, and this looks just like a Microsoft help file, doesn't it? Well, that's because that's what it is. So let's go down here to overtime and look at the overtime members. And here's all the things that you can do for overtime. And here's what all the properties are. And you click on one of these things, and it'll tell you, this is the authorized by. Here's the justification property. All these kind of methods. Here's the things that you can do. You can find an overtime request by an ID. You can find one by organization. You can save all these kind of things that you can do. So this looks just like a Microsoft help file because it is a Microsoft help file. Now, I never ever expect the users to go to this help file. That's not what it's for. This is programmer to programmer. This is the business logic layer. And as it happened, we had one team working on the data access layer, one team working on the business logic layer, and we would provide, and then a third team working on the graphical user interface or the user service layer. I worked on the BLL, and every time I made a change, I would upgrade this file and send it to the other programmers saying, okay, I made a tweak to the BLL, here's your new documentation on how this thing is going to work. And occasionally they would come back to me and say, I really need a method that's going to help me here. And I'd go, okay, I didn't think about that. And so I would code that method, change the documentation, and send it back to them. And of course I'd always have to make sure that I didn't make breaking changes and stuff. So this is programmer to programmer documentation. All right. Again, external documentation like this, and this looks complicated, doesn't it? I mean, this looks very time intensive. Nah. There's actually a piece of software that does this for me. I actually made comments inside my source code, and this piece of software will pull the comments out and produce this file. I had to write hardly any of this. Kind of cool. Okay. System documentation describes upper level kind of things. The overall documentation of what the heck this thing is supposed to do. And the system documentation is, you're brand new, you don't even have a clue what this thing does. And so system documentation is often like a Word document, not a diagram or something. And, like, here's the purpose for this thing, and here's the accounting philosophy that we're using, and here's the financials and how accounts are built and how permissions work and security considerations. This is just a document, and if you wanted to, you could stop right there, or you could dig a little bit deeper and say, okay, here's how a transition works, and here's how the database works, and here's how these things work, and the abstractions, and then you can keep going, here's how the GUI, works, and just keep going. So that's an overall document showing the top level philosophy. It tells you what the program does, what its constraints are. It draws that little boundary. Here's what it does, here's what it does not do. Very clearly defines the philosophy of the application. How it's put together, why it's put together this particular way, what controls are in use, those kind of things. And you should imagine this with a financial application, so the controls were a little tight. Okay. So, the next one they talk about is operations documentation and user documentation. I will warn you that I often break up the documentation into two chunks. I do not have like one set of documentation that handles the installation of and configuration of the software and the users, because quite frankly the users are not ever going to install the software. They're just going to be the poor people that use it. So I make a conscious distinction to have two documents, not one. So I'll give you another example. So here's a setup and configuration guide for a piece of software. And so down here is how to configure this guy, and here's the configuration utility and the screens you're going to see, and the settings and what all the settings mean, and how to turn features off or on. Again, only an administrator can do this. So if the users don't even have permission they'll never ever see this screen. Well, if they never see the screen, don't put it in their documentation. That'll just annoy them. So go through and do every single one of the screens and what every single one of the fields mean. There's even philosophy in here on what to do and all sorts of things. So this is the type of documentation designed for system administrators. Now contrast that with the user's documentation, where it basically just says, here's what the icons look like, and here's when you click the button, here's what happens. And it goes through some things you can do, what the options are, little things like, here's all the things in the file menu. Now come on, I would never put the file menu in the administrators, because I would think that they'd be smart enough to go through and look at that and go, yeah, okay, I understand what that means. But in the user documentation, it goes into a little bit more detail on actually how to use the application rather than to configure it. So I highly recommend that you don't combine operation documentation with user documentation. On 471, they talk a little bit more about user documentation. It talks about system overview that clearly describes the major system features, capabilities, and limitations. Okay. Describes any source documentation, you know, where it's coming, where data is coming from. Overview of the menus and data entry screens. Examples of reports that are generated. The security and audit information. Explanation of responsibilities, like who's responsible for what input. That would be very handy. Procedures for requesting changes and reporting problems. I really like that. I told you guys a story about how a programmer who on the menu put one report a bug and send me feedback. Fantastic idea. I stole that idea and use it myself now. Frequently asked questions. Yep, there's frequently asked questions in there. You know, explanation how to get help. You know, where to go for additional information. Okay. On page 474, they talk about the management approval process, and that after the system testing is completed, and you got to present your results to management, and you should describe the test results. I mean, good or bad. Don't sugarcoat these things, and say, okay, here's the results of our testing. Here's all the required documentation. You know, here's all the things, and here's the detailed time schedules, the costs, staffing requirements. Everything it takes to make the thing fully operational. And then they talk about the system installation and evaluation in a little bit more detail. So on page 475, they talk about you prepare a separate operations and test environment. In other words, don't throw it in there with live data. Have some test data put together and have a test environment where people can play with it and look at it and show it off without using live data. So this provides an opportunity for training, so they can't screw anything up. Oh my God, I deleted a record. That's okay. It's just training data. It's okay. You can do that data conversion, and I will recommend, if you're converting from an old system to a new, that you do an initial run to see how long it takes, because there'll be some issues. There always is. Some field doesn't come across exactly right, and maybe there's something wrong with the data, and so you go back to them and say, if you were to fix this date field in your existing data, when it comes time to conversion, it's going to work so much better. Will you please go in and do that? So I would even do it a second time to see if they actually did what you asked them to do, and calculate how long it's going to take. You pull 10,000 records and it took you half a day. You could whip out your calculator really quick and say, okay, now it's going to take me 4 days to do this, unless you guys, do what I ask you to do. Okay. And then, of course, you're going to be carrying out, a post-implementation evaluation on how well things work. That's the whole point of ISO, is you can't just, okay, we're done. No, you need to evaluate how well you met your own metrics that you created. Okay. So on page 475, continuing, you talk about a testing environment that the system is going to work in. And again, environment could mean it could mean two things: the physical environment that the system is going to work in, and this logical, philosophical environment of the users involved. So again, you need a test environment that you can play with without worrying about crashing things. They talk about the test data, and they have IT testing, and they have user testing. Okay. Okay, on page 476, they talk about the training, and you really need a training plan. If you don't have a training plan, you're just kind of floundering around, training whatever the heck you think needs to be done, and that's not going to work for you. And we're coming up on the 15-minute mark, so this is probably a good place to stop, and we'll pick this up in just a few.